how, as an athlete, can you ensure that you forge a good relationship with your coach?
Yeah, there's this term called coachability. The extent to which you as an athlete can engage with what your coach is saying. From a coach perspective in a team sport, I think the first thing is setting the environment and creating an environment where the players feel that they can come to you and speak to you with if they have any issues, where the emphasis is on effort and improvement and making them feel competent, making them feel good at what they do through the way in which you offer feedback to athletes.
Hey, thanks for tuning into the 182nd episode of the Athletes Podcast, where today we feature Professor Adam Nichols. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Hull over in the UK, specifically working with professional sports clubs, organizations, leaders, individuals, and bringing to you folks, listeners, consumers of sports psychology insights, breaking, bleeding edge information that's at the forefront of performance. Whether you're an athlete, coach, high performer in any situation, this conversation applies to you, and I'm excited to hear feedback from this conversation. As you guys know, we're putting a ton of effort and hard work into our YouTube channel, so if you could drop a comment, hit that like button, it would mean the world to us. This episode's also sponsored by Rooted. This is their prenatal version. They've got vitamins, minerals, electrolytes, superfoods, probiotics, all the good stuff that you need in your daily activities to live those high-performing lives. Professor Adam Nichols is also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitor. He reaps what he sows. I'm excited for you folks to listen to the 182nd episode of the Athletes Podcast featuring Professor Adam Nichols. Here we go. The work that you're doing, the research that you've done in the past, Professor Adam Nichols, is going to save lives, ultimately, for athletes. It might not seem like it on the surface, but I think the work that you're doing, your master's in sports psychology, you've got an incredible background with many accolades, to say the least. I'll probably list a couple in our intro, but I'll let you take the floor here for a couple seconds to introduce yourself before I ask you some questions and educate, entertain, and inspire the next generation of athletes with your presence today.
Okay, so hello Dave. My name's Professor Adam Nichols. I'm a professor of sport and exercise psychology. My research is about athlete well-being and how we can enhance that, whether it's through stress and coping, or stress and coping training, or reducing the prevalence of doping among athletes. Because we know that doping is linked to a wide variety of both physical and psychological side effects. So what I try to do is create research that's practical and has solutions for athletes, really, to enhance their well-being.
And you're also reaping what you sow. You're a silver medalist at the 2021 British Open that was held at the Loughborough University Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Championship. So you practice what you preach, and you are implementing some of the athletic abilities and research that you're doing. Can you talk about how you're able to manage everything that you do, being a dad, professor, sitting on various leadership roles?
Yeah. It is tough, but I'm a firm believer in self-care and giving yourself some time to do something that you want to do. And for me, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There's no better way of de-stressing than having a 100-kilogram guy try to grapple with you. You can't be thinking about anything else when you're training. And then in terms of the competition, I guess it's challenging myself. I played competitive sport when I was young, semi-professional rugby. And it's a way of being able to do something at my age of having some time for myself, and it's really good that I do get to test what I practice what I preach by getting out into the competitions and then actually seeing actually trying to use some of the coping strategies that I recommend, and so it's good. It definitely helps me with my research and also my personal well-being as well.
I think you're like the professor version on the UK side of Mark Zuckerberg. He recently adopted Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's applying it, winning championships. It's kind of cool. You guys got some similarities.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's brilliant though. And as I say, you make lots of new friends and just, I absolutely love it. It's one of the best things that I've ever done, and would thoroughly recommend everyone does it because it's the sort of thing for everyone. You can compete in your own age group, your own weight group. It's Yeah, I absolutely love it. Yeah, it's fantastic.
So I know you played rugby. You said you were fly half, playing like Division III, I believe, and you also have dabbled with the sport of golf. Obviously, being able to play these sports allows you to communicate with others, athletes, coaches, in a way that is like a language that they're able to understand, for lack of a better term. And I think that probably helps you when you are educating coaches on well-being, mental health, sports psychology. Can you share like how you got into this? Because obviously this isn't something that, you wake up one day and you're like, oh, I'm going to help coaches and athletes, but probably instilled from a young age playing other sports. Maybe give us some background there.
Yeah, so as a youngster, I was a junior tennis player. So yeah, I've played quite a few sports. So one thing I probably kind of excelled in lots of sports without being kind of really, really good in one sport, which it does disappoint me to a certain extent. But so yes, I was a junior tennis player. So I won like county championships, and then I played in national events. And one thing I realised is that I wasn't kind of getting the most of my ability, and it wasn't technically. Technically, I was fine. Tactically, I was good. Well, maybe tactically limited, but it was just this I couldn't really control my nerves, and I get really, really nervous prior to competitions. And I would go out there, and I just wouldn't ever, do my best. And this, I think, at a county level, I was fine because my ability could override my kind of psychological deficiencies. But when I got up that level higher, where I needed to be at my very best, I couldn't quite do it. And this was as a 14 and 15-year-old that I realised this, and it's probably then that I thought, actually, I didn't think then I was going to be a sports psychologist. I think I was going to be a PE teacher at this point. But as I did my degree, I actually realised, this is something that I've got an interest in, and actually, I think, it's something with my experiences I could actually help other athletes, and that's where it kind of started, actually.
So, how does a plan to be PE teacher end up publishing more than 85 journal articles, write 4 books, edit a book? Like, you've impacted hundreds, if not thousands, across your time. Is this something that's the power of compounding taken effect? Were you opened up one day to say, hey, like I could really help a ton of other people based on what I'm facing?
Yeah, it was just this. I suppose I did my undergraduate degree in physical education and psychology, and then you have this crossroads where in England, whether you go to do teacher training or you go and do a masters, and I just thought I'm going to go for it and go for the masters with a view to doing a PhD. So I knew on the very first day of doing my masters that I was going to take a PhD. Probably my lecturers wouldn't have picked me to do a PhD. Yeah, because at this point I'm dyslexic as well, and at this point it was undiagnosed, and so my writing skills weren't particularly great, and I kind of scraped through my masters, but ultimately I think my ideas have always been pretty good in terms of research and supporting athletes, and I really enjoyed the kind of the research element of my masters, and yeah, and it kind of grew from there. Yeah, I certainly think I've surprised quite a few of my lecturers over time. I'm not, average student basically.
And I think that there's
Who's now published a lot more than most of them. So, which I quite enjoy sometimes.
absolutely, as you should. And I think to call yourself an average student is being humble on your end, but I think it's probably also inspiring for those to hear who are listening right now, because they might be going through school. They might think that they're in a quote unquote average student. They might not have the best writing ability. They might not have the best speaking ability. I by no means had the best speaking ability. You do 181 conversations like this, you start to get better, right? You start to expose yourself to those uncomfortable situations, kind of like some of the research that you talk about, right? The prevalence of anxiety and depression among rugby players specifically is something you've researched, but we talk about eating disorders. Like, when it comes to how mental toughness correlates with resilience, emotional intelligence, sport motivation, and self-efficacy, can you share what you've learned and seen over the years?
Yeah, so I guess mental toughness is quite it's a quote, it's a term that's used, lots by commentators, by coaches, and within the academic literature, there's been a lot of a lot of kind of confusion about what it really is, or a lot of heated debates, sorry. And I kind of view mental toughness as an athlete's ability to be able to maintain their performance under pressure. Under the most intense pressure, they can perform well. And that's without kind of getting into these academic heated debates about whether it's this or whether it's that. Essentially, I see it as that. And when I speak to coaches, when I speak to elite athletes, they can kind of relate to that. And what mental toughness is, it's kind of an umbrella term that relates or is linked to lots of other different constructs, of which some of those are motivation. We know that the most mentally tough athletes are also highly motivated. They're motivated to do well. They also have this self-efficacy. They have this strong belief in their ability to be successful. So when the chips are down, the most mentally tough athletes still believe in themselves. They evaluate stress differently to kind of the least mentally tough people. So when we're in a stressful situation, we can view stress as either a challenge and focus on what we want to happen, or we can view it as a threat, what might go wrong. So I might drop a ball in front of a selector. I might kind of lose today. Whereas those who are mentally tough actually focus on what they want to happen. I want to impress that selector. I'm going to play well today. I'm going to put into practice what I've done. And so for these reasons, mental toughness is quite an important construct, because it allows athletes to perform at their very best when they really need it.
And it almost ties into visualization then, in that sense. I mean, you've called it mental imagery and how it enhances sporting performance, but like they go hand in hand then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so there's lots and lots of evidence to show that mental imagery can enhance performance too. And so what I kind of advocate as a sports psychologist working with athletes is actually to engage in a variety of different mental skills. And one of those is mental imagery training. So I'll go through different protocols, get to know the athlete, get to find out what it is about them that kind of they're maybe not struggling with, but what they can improve on, and then developing an individualized imagery intervention for the athlete, which we incorporate not just visions, but smells, noises, physical sensations, feelings, all those different kind of senses within imagery training, and it's found to be much more beneficial.
How do the best athletes incorporate this? Because obviously it's easy to say, hey, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to win. I'm not going to focus on the negative. When push comes to shove, the water's on the golf course on the left. You start looking at it, it might get intimidating. Do they focus strictly on the positive, and is that ingrained? What are the strategies that you would suggest to use?
Yes, the best athletes don't look at the water on the left. They're kind of some of the ones athletes I've worked with across all different sports and in coaches as well. They have this laser focus about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. They rely on their pre-shot routine, the routine that they've used, lots of times. Incorporate coping strategies. Block out any negative thoughts of distraction, which is essentially what the water is, and then execute the shot when they're ready to do so, and only when they're ready to do so without rushing the shot, and execute it. And can we? So that they're the top level athletes. I suppose they don't do it all the time, but can we as coaches, as psychologists, increase the likelihood of people being able to perform under pressure? Yes, we can. We know there's evidence to show that we can change the way people think. We can teach them coping strategies. Something that I do as my research within stress and coping is about how I can teach different coping strategies. So visualization is one, logical analysis, get the players to think through a situation, emotion regulation strategies. So there's quite a few different strategies that we can teach them, which can be successful across all sports.
So when you bring up coping mechanisms, and we're going to stick with golf just because it's one that I can use imagery and I can relate to it. You look at like a Matthew Fitzpatrick who takes an extended period of time during his pre-shot routine, like you said, waiting until he's ready to hit that shot. A guy like Brooks Koepka is kind of pissed about the fact that he's taking so long. It's getting him out of his routine. It's an interesting dynamic where you're playing in an individual sport. There's time limits. You're having to compete against others. Like, how would you, or maybe a better question is, where do you see people going wrong with their coping mechanisms or with their pre-shot routines that they could improve, maybe almost just like off the top without having even to look at them?
Yeah, that's interesting. Just going back to that example, I think Matthew Fitzpatrick is doing exactly the right thing, adhering to his routine. Uh, and that's one thing when I've worked with, because I've worked with quite a few like international adolescent golfers, is one thing they'll do is deviate from their routine. That's one thing you should never ever do. So, for example, if you do two practice swings, normally you do two practice swings all the time. Don't just do one, or don't do any if you go through any of your pre-shot routine. And then if you're Brooks Koepka, know what's going to be happening that day. Know that you're playing with Fitzpatrick, who is a bit slower, and make a plan of action of what you're going to do to stop yourself getting frustrated, and also to stop his slow play having a negative impact on your performance. So it's like being prepared and having a plan is what I would suggest to athletes that I work with.
Yeah, and I guess the most athletes don't go in prepared and with a plan. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, and this is a problem. It's again, so I've worked, with kind of some quite high level coaches, and one thing that they say is that sports psychology is probably the least understood and least used element of kind of sports performance. And yeah, a lot of athletes maybe don't go in with a plan of how they're going to react to different situations, and how they're going to react positively. Rather than thinking, right, I'm going to lose my temper. It's like, well, okay, it's going to be slow today. What can I do? What can I do when that happens? Because it will happen. How can I manage my emotions positively rather than getting frustrated?
So that's managing your own expectations. Obviously, you can't control anything that you can't control. What are some steps that people can do when it comes to preparing for that event?
So just going back, so we can't, things that are uncontrollable, we can't control those. But what we can do, which I advocate, is managing your emotional responses to those things. So you can't control selection, you can't control opponents, you can't control the weather. But what I can do is I can control how that makes me feel through emotion-focused coping strategies. And I think it's really important, and that one thing that I advocate is this kind of coping effectiveness training, which you respond to stresses you can control in a different way to stresses you can't control. So when you can control the stressor, you engage in what is known as problem-focused coping strategies. So if, for example, you've got a lack of fitness and that's a stressor, you would use time management strategies to work out when you can fit in extra conditioning sessions, speak to for example, a strength and conditioning coach, work out what you need to do, analyze your own life to kind of work out why you may be suffering from a lack of fitness. And then if you can't control the stressor, like we just mentioned, that's when you use these emotion regulation coping strategies. And we know that if you kind of stick to that approach, that it's linked positively with performance. I had my PhD student test this model with Premier League academy players, and it worked really well in both in their footballing careers, but also outside of football in terms of education. So it helped these young players, young athletes.
So incredible to hear. And I think it's important to mention your book, Psychology for Coaches, Theory and Practice, has also been translated into Arabic and Hungarian. But this book is impacting people across the globe. You have NCAA Div 1 coaches requesting for bulk orders. How has this adoption of your book been?
Yeah, it's been really good. And I think a lot of that is through, being on social media, particularly LinkedIn. And it's something that really pleases me, because when you write these academic books, or we write these books, and you're not really doing it for the money, because it's not a Harry Potter, it's not going to sell millions, but you're doing it to kind of make a difference. And the only way you can do that is by getting out there, by selling copies to these coaches. And yeah, and it's really pleased me, how many people around the world are buying it, and the feedback I receive about the book is so pleasing, really. And I think it can have a massive impact on helping the well-being of both coaches and athletes. So yeah, it's something that I'm really, really pleased about. I'll be starting work on the 4th edition next year, I believe.
Amazing. You mentioned LinkedIn. That's where we got connected a couple weeks ago. I had been following along and seen some of your content, had earmarked you as one of the guests that I wanted to get on the show. But when you think about athletes right now, our goal, our mission to educate, entertain, and inspire, you talked about it at the beginning of this podcast, the fact that you are or suffer from dyslexia. And like, this is something that maybe people don't talk about enough. And I wanted to have you share kind of how you've been able to push through these difficult times over the past 2 decades. Because you said you suffered from the anxiety, the difficulties as an athlete. You're now obviously still dealing with stuff. You've got 2 kids that you're managing, a family life on top of all your other responsibilities. I wanted to first give you kudos, but also shine light on what you've been doing. You said you're out there on social media and like you are making an impact to hundreds and, like I said, thousands of people's lives, even by doing this conversation here. So I am grateful for your time here and I really appreciate it. And I think I'd love to give you space to share on like how you've been able to do that, because it's remarkable.
Yeah, so firstly, I think, while being on LinkedIn, I've had quite a few parents reach out to me and, talk about their children who are dyslexic, and I think, yeah, it's really important that we raise the awareness of this and focus on what strengths dyslexic people have. So for me, there are definitely strengths. The weaknesses are kind of in the writing, but the strengths are the way in which I approach problems and I think about things differently. But how have I pushed through it? I guess it's probably been like kind of sheer bloody mindedness about, knowing, particularly, from my masters, knowing that I wanted to do a masters and knowing that I wanted to do a PhD, despite kind of my lecturers, even at my masters, probably not thinking I had the academic capability to do that, probably because of my grades. But one thing I thought I had the ideas, and it's the ideas which, anyone can learn to write, but not everyone can have the ideas. Ideas are something that, for me, are the really special thing that I've had, and it's the writing that's taken me years and years to practice and get better at. So I think it's just been this, I think just determination really, and not accepting what other, kind of negative criticism. Obviously, you need to take it on board. I remember one time I submitted some work to my PhD supervisor, and he read half of it and just said, "This is rubbish. I'm not going to read the rest of it." At this point, we didn't know I had dyslexia. And it just meant that I had to spend a bit more time on the work. And, when I submitted that piece of work, I thought it was error-free. I'd read it lots of times, but, clearly it wasn't. But it's just about kind of using what you've got and using what you have, your strengths, and identifying them and then kind of applying them is something that I think I've probably done.
I think it's been proven in research, and I'll probably try and find a link to the study around like adversity at a young age and like becoming successful later on down in life, or as a child having to push through that perseverance. Obviously, you've probably been exposed to this for athletes on a daily. I think one of the other topics that I wanted to bring up with you though is like challenges for planning for life after. I mean, I'll use specifically for a rugby career that you've referenced and done studies on, but for athletes in general, like this is a tough topic and it's challenging because you spend 5, 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years playing your sport, competing, training, maybe up till 35, 40 is like the last glimpse of those hallmark years. And then you got the next half of your life you got to deal with.
Yeah. And there's lots of different factors, I think, that come into play. So one, your life's organised for you. You're with your team. You're with your best friends, your mates. That you've got these experiences that no one else has ever had, and it brings you together. And I think another thing that I think gets overlooked is that we've got to remember that these people are sometimes world class at what they do. They're the gifted ones. They're the ones who have made it at the very, very top levels of their sport if they're professional. And then how do they then go on and accept maybe they're not going to be ever as good at anything as, in comparison to what they were when they were a professional athlete, and how do they deal with that? How do they find something that gives them the buzz that, being a professional athlete did and competing did? So I think it's a variety of things which contribute to kind of often poor mental health among retired athletes. Even those who, in my experience, who, go on and do really well, have a successful career in another area. they still say, oh, it still doesn't get, I still don't have that feeling as I did when I played in front of however many thousands of athletes. They just have insecurities about, are they still as, are, are they insecurities about, whether they're able to fulfill what they did as a professional athlete.
It's I wanted to bring up that because not only are there young athletes listening to this podcast, but we also have current athletes between the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL. I wanted to ask that question because I think it's important for those listening. What should they be doing during their time as an athlete right now between the ages of 20, 25, 30, 35, as they're at that pinnacle level, building brand, maybe developing that support network, talking with other coaches for plans afterwards? What are some of those steps that you would suggest?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on there. And one thing when I work with athletes, and I know there's a particular club in England about they have to spend a certain amount of their time preparing. This is a club in England called Saracens Rugby Club, kind of really well known in England for looking after the development side of all their players. So all their players have another kind of string to their bow. They have plans in place ready for when they do retire. And of course, we accept that nothing might replace their professional sport, but equally knowing that you've got something in place, you're working towards something will help them actually kind of manage the difficult situation. Also kind of developing what I would kind of suggest a few things. Find a mentor in an area in which you're wanting to go into. So you're a professional athlete. What career do you want to go into next? Okay, identify that career. Who can you then have as a mentor over the next few years? Someone to share ideas off. And then also when you finish your career, you've got this, like kind of say, this other support network in place, which is kind of a non-sporting support network. Find out what your interests are again, and then actually then start looking into that and building this next phase of your career. But I think having a mentor is something that'd be really, really important.
And then when it comes to that mentor, are there certain criterias? Obviously, what you get into mentally after on, but like I've heard you talk about developing leaders, and I think as a leader, you're obviously trying to support others within your network that are around on your team, for instance, but you're also looking up to those who've inspired you. When you look at like maybe developing a leader, do you try and follow along from an inspiration that's above, or what are the steps as far as becoming a better leader maybe as well? I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah, so I've had quite a few kind of leadership roles in my job at the University of Hull, and I think that's probably where my career is probably going more now, into kind of leading, kind of leadership roles, etc. And so one thing I've done, and I think this is probably fairly common, is I think about who I've had as my mentors, who have been my leaders, what are the attributes which I think are really good, and what are the attributes which I think maybe could be improved, and then try and take in kind of a mixture of that. And I think that's one. I also I also have my own mentor from a leadership perspective, and I speak to him on a kind of a regular basis about maybe things that have happened, how I dealt with certain situations, how I could deal with them better. So it's kind of an evolving process. And of course, I'm well aware of the literature and how I can use that in certain circumstances for developing my own leadership. But I think it's important that it's something that we involve as a lead.
I think the proof's in the pudding. Like the Vegas Golden Knights have just won the Stanley Cup. They had a ton of previous captains on that team. I was actually doing a ton of research on the Tampa Bay Lightning over the past couple of years and their cup runs. I think they deliberately went after captains and leaders that had played amongst their entire career at any age, whether it was WHL, OHL, all the way up to professional levels. And I think there was like something like 13, 14, or 15 captains previously on those teams. And it was like, oh, no wonder this team's doing well and they've got a good chemistry and they're all willing to maybe take a bit of a pay cut for the end result of a Stanley Cup. Like those things to me are what's separating good from great organizations in sport now. I know you've had the ability to work with someone like Stuart Lancaster. when I talk about sports greatness, who comes to mind in your eyes?
In terms of greatness, in terms of leaders, it's the what's it, the NBA coach, where The Last Dance on Netflix.
Phil Jackson.
Yeah, I really liked his approach to leadership. I really like that. Because one thing I think about leadership is a crucial element of leadership is the recruitment, like you were just saying, and now I'm involved in recruiting, staff members, and essentially, if you can get the recruitment right, get the sorts of people into your organisation, whether it's a sporting organisation, any institution, any organisation, then essentially leadership becomes an easier task, because you're recruiting people who kind of have the same vision as you, have the same competencies, who are able to kind of do their job. And I think that's so important, the recruitment side. And I think we're, as an institution, as a department, we're kind of reaping the benefits of bringing in some, like you say, some people who are kind of their own have leadership potential, and it's really paying dividends.
The difference between hiring A players and B players is not the 5 or 10K difference in the salary. It's like the output of a B player is here, the output of an A player is here, and could 5x even 2, 3, or 4 B players, right? I see it in the business world all the time, and now it's like, hey, that can be applied to sport, and there's so many commonalities between the two. It's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy because you get in the right people, and then what happens is they're the people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the want of the better good. And then what actually happens is that then everyone else in the institution kind of know that everyone else is pulling their weight, and it just boosts morale. It's just it's so important, and that's one thing I'm working at the moment. Just understanding more as a kind of a young leader about how we can improve that and select the right people.
Yeah, as the director of research within the Department of Sport, Health, and Exercise Science, when you have a subject like mental health, well-being, sports psychology, I'm curious, you can't see this. People love being able to have tangible, they see the results, like, oh, if I do X plus Y, it'll equal Z. But that's not necessarily the case when it comes to well-being, mental health. You can't see what's going on up in here. How are you capable of showcasing the benefits, the need? Because you already touched on it, the fact that sports psychology is probably the least known subject within sports right now. How are you giving people enough value so that they can adopt it and be like, okay, because I see the value, a ton of the people listening see the value, general pop doesn't necessarily see the value yet.
Yeah, and I'd say a lot of some of the old school type coaches don't see the value of it either. I've worked with some coaches who you're in an organization, an elite organization, who they don't want you there. You're there because maybe the director of sport up above has said, we need a psychologist in. And for those sorts of people, I think it's very, very hard, it's very hard to convince them of the benefits of kind of what you can bring as a sports psychologist. I think that's probably changing with time, and I think it's getting better, because we know that there's the higher prevalence of kind of mental health symptoms and disorders among particularly elite athletes than the general population. So if you're a coach working at an elite level, you will have had experience of coaching athletes who have maybe anxiety or clinical anxiety, clinical depression. So hopefully they know the worth of what we can do and the things we can recommend as a psychologist to kind of help these athletes. But it can be difficult at times. I think it can be really, really difficult with some coaches to kind of get the buy-in from them.
How frustrating is that for you, knowing what you know?
Yeah, it's really frustrating, because that you observe the coach, and what they're doing may be impeding the well-being of some of the athletes, some of the more vulnerable athletes, but they're then unwilling to change their kind of behaviour. So in those instances, I really feel for the athletes who are struggling, because it is frustrating, and I feel my frustration is is directed. It's more that the athletes could be in a better place,
For sure.
but they're not. Yeah,
Are you able to
and that's hard.
Are you able to pick it out? Like, can you see from afar watching, like, you can tell when athletes aren't playing and competing at their best, performing at their best? And, like, can you tell when a coach has that kind of energy or negative energy around them?
Yeah, I think when you know the athletes and when you spend time with them, you see them day to day in training, and you know them as a person. Often you can just see something's maybe not quite right on a competition day. And then when you speak to them, you kind of find out, why they're worried about, what their insecurities are. So I've worked with some athletes who've said, they drop a ball in the first minute of a match, and their immediate thought is what the coach is going to say at the performance analysis session on the Tuesday and how they're going to be criticised. And this is while the match is ongoing. So it's difficult. There needs to be accountability. Professional sport is about winning. If the team doesn't win, the coaches lose their job, the players don't get a contract. But how can we as coaches, as psychologists, kind of manage it to enhance this well-being for the players? But it is difficult, yeah.
Yeah, and I can only imagine how frustrating it would be from your perspective, knowing everything that you have under your belt and trying to showcase these simple benefits to an older headed, maybe stubborn individual who's not willing to learn, right? And not willing to be open to what's clearly having an impact positively across the board in every sport. I think that's the coolest part also, that, like, I know you've got research in golf, experience in tennis, rugby, but this applies to every single athlete out there, no matter who you are, what sport you're playing. And it's just such a important subject that I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise on. You've done work for the International Olympic Committee, the European Commission, the World Anti-Doping Agency. It was actually kind of a funny commonality because I was also a doping control chaperone officer with Rachel Corbett back in Ontario for a couple of years, working at the U18 wheelchair basketball championships, fun events like that, going to people's homes, knocking on them at 5 a.m., getting them to pee in a cup, like crazy things that you have to do, but you're exposed to the world of sport, doping. What's been some of the wildest stories that you've seen over the years? Because a couple decades in the game, between research, working with athletes, coaches, I'm sure you've got some that come to mind that you could probably share with our audience.
Yeah, you hear some quite kind of disturbing things, particularly with surrounding doping. So I was working with one particular coach in rugby union, and there was a player who didn't quite make it to get a professional scholarship, and then for whatever reason he turned up at a training session. Some players got injured, so he was filling in, and all the players were like, he's been on the growths. So 17-year-old kid being on the growth hormone because he was absolutely huge, and he bulked up in such a short period of time. There's things like that which are crazy, and they're so, like, as a parent myself, so worrying now to think that young people are taking these chances on their health, because ultimately they are. They're using meds. Well, first of all, they don't know whether what they're taking is what it says on the label. They're taking it unsupervised. They're taking it in far higher quantities than it was ever meant for. Yeah, so things like that have kind of concern me. Some of the good things. One of them, my first ever watching a rugby match was England v Scotland, and the player who scored the conversion with the last kick of the game was John Callard, who I ended up writing a book with. And I remember, I never ever told him this, but I was sat in his house, working on a draft of the book, and I was just sat there thinking, wow, this is brilliant. My first ever kind of memory of watching rugby on TV was seeing you kick the ball at Murrayfield in front of 80 or 60, 70, 80,000 people, however many it was on TV, and now we're working together on this project, which was, and I learnt lots from him, being a high-level rugby player and high-level coach, about how he sees psychology and from a coaching perspective. So yes, there's been some interesting things over the years, but unfortunately, I guess a lot of it you can't talk about. It's the confidentiality. So
I figured there was probably some snippets you could share, but one of the things you brought up there was the fact that you were talking about kicking in particular with rugby, This is a specific skill. Again, your psychology within sport can apply to every athlete, but again, it's almost like putting for golf. Like, this is a very unique skill. You're set up. You've not many variables at play other than the wind or the environment that you're kicking in. Like, can you share some of the findings that you found from that? What maybe you identified as some positives or like best traits in those athletes?
Yeah, so the best traits in those athletes, again, those who make it to the top. So I worked with John Callard, so he was the England national kicking coach for a number of years, and he would then offer support to all the kickers from the England first team all the way down to the academy England teams. And one thing they kind of observe with those sorts of players is just their ability, the best ones anyway, is to remain focused regardless of the situation of the matches, whether it's the first minute, the last minute, whether it's a kick to win the match, a kick to avoid, to get a draw. They just have this ability to kind of switch off. And one thing that we worked on and that helps that is these, again, we've spoken about this before, is these pre-performance routines. It's about ensuring that you have a routine that works and that you stick to that kind of consistently, whether it's in training or matches. And I think that's one thing that for any athletes who are engaged in close skills, kicking, putting, golf shots, hockey, in field hockey, etc., is having these routines and sticking to them. Find out what works, develop a solid routine, and practice it.
Is that the same for like your nutrition pregame? Like, would you incorporate all that the same? Because I know, like, and it's one of the things that you study, like eating disorder prevalence, ranging from 0 to 19% in males, and then anywhere from 6 to 45% among elite female athletes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, eating disorders are much higher among elite athletes than they are in the kind of the general population, and as is disordered eating, and a lot of that is, particularly with females wanting to be leaner and kind of being in more kind of aesthetic sports, so gymnastics, diving, etc., where performance is rated based on what the performance looks like, and then and it's worrying because athletes who have these eating disorders engage in sort of things like restricted eating or binging and purging or using laxatives to kind of lose weight, and they have this kind of a preoccupation with health, with kind of their food, and it's not just those sorts of sports. I've worked with professional cyclists. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I work with kind of performance issues, but some athletes have, cyclists in particular, presented with kind of maybe not an eating disorder, but certainly disordered eating. And when those instances have, I've kind of referred them to a clinical psychologist. But it's just from a coaching perspective, it's about an awareness of that prevalence is quite, is higher among these people. And if you're an athlete who, think you have kind of eating disordered eating, I think it's really important to speak to, a doctor, really, a medical practitioner, and seek support.
Yeah, it is, because it's so prevalent. I would just echo those comments. I think the knowledge that you bring as a professor of psychology from the University of Hull is second to none. I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and insight with the Athletes Podcast listeners. I do have two more questions. The one that just came back to me now is revolving around the coaches. We've talked about this for 45 minutes now, around the relationships with coaches being important. So now my question is, how, as an athlete, can you ensure that you forge a good relationship with your coach?
Yeah, there's this term called coachability, and it's about the extent to which you as an athlete can kind of engage with what your coach is saying. So, it's little things such as how you communicate with your coach. So, for example, if you kind of have a disagreement with kind of the way your coach sees your trajectory or what you should be working on, how you should be developing, it's like this, how you approach the coach and how you discuss them, kind of in a kind of an open mind rather than a closed mind, and not being dismissive of the coach. Because I think it's different for different sports. If you're an individual sport and you're a golfer, for example, you have a problem with your coach. you go and find another coach. That can happen, and it happens quite a lot. Same with tennis, individual sports. Whereas if you're a team sport athlete, the relationship, it can be a bit more difficult to navigate, because ultimately you don't hire or fire your coach. That's done by the organisation you play for. And in those instances, I think it's about treading carefully with your coach, but also if you have, I think if you have issues that you think could be resolved, it's about making sure you communicate these with your coach in a tactful way, I think.
And then same if the roles are reversed, as a coach, how am I, going into a group of 18 guys or girls and making sure that I create a good relationship with them and that they have buy-in to what I'm coaching?
Yeah, so from a coach perspective in a team sport, I think the first thing is setting the environment and creating an environment where the players feel that they can come to you and speak to you with if they have any issues. Creating an environment where the kind of what we call a kind of a mastery climate, where the emphasis is on effort and improvement, and not shouting at players, but actually caring for players, giving the players an opportunity to engage in leadership in a role in what they do in day-to-day coaching, making them feel cared for, and making them feel competent, making them feel good at what they do through the way in which you offer feedback to coaches. Feedback to athletes.
Yeah. No, it's perfect. I'm curious. I know you mentioned Phil Jackson was one of the individuals you liked. Were there any other inspirations for you growing up, whether it's professionally, personally, athletics? Anyone that you wanted to maybe shout out or highlight on the show?
Oh God, that's. I think, I guess one of the coaches that I really liked watching was when I was young, was the England football manager, Sir Bobby Robson, who passed away quite a few years ago. And one thing I really liked about watching him play is just you could see how much he cared about the results, but also how much he really cared for all the players. And in that, even at a young age, when I was watching that, you could just see that. And then he went on to then coach at club level afterwards. And one thing you hear about the players speaking about him is just kind of what a good person he was, and I think that's one thing I try and take into kind of my leadership roles, is about putting the person first, and kind of trying to be a good leader, be a good person first and foremost.
You certainly are doing that, Professor Adam Nichols. I can't thank you enough for your time. Your expertise, wisdom, and knowledge is going to continue to help us educate, entertain, and inspire the next generation of athletes. As you know, as someone who's listened to the show in the past, the way we wrap up every episode is we ask our guest what their biggest piece of advice would be for the next generation of athletes. And I'd love for you to share that now after 50 minutes of gold. You got a couple extra snippets for us?
Yeah, my biggest thing would be about believing in yourself, and regardless of what people tell you, you have a plan. You create your own vision about what you want to achieve and how you're going to do that. So it's like believing in yourself and having a plan of how you're going to kind of achieve your ultimate goals. That's and don't be what's the word? Don't setbacks happen, but this belief should be stronger than any setbacks, and learn from setbacks. So kind of three things: believe in yourself, learn from setbacks, what went wrong, how can you improve it, and have goals, but importantly, what can you do to achieve your goals?
A simple 3-step process to follow. Thanks to Professor Nichols. Thank you so much again for your time. Where can people find you online, social media? I'll make sure to link the book, but where else can people source out your content?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably a good one. Adam Nichols on LinkedIn. I kind of share kind of a lot of stuff. And then also I'm on Instagram. My profile is closed, but I do post, things on there. So A plus Nick. A plus Nick on Instagram. Maybe put a link on there.
Amazing.
That's the dyslexia coming in there.
No,
I think it's something like that. Yeah.
Hey, I really appreciate your time. I can't wait to get over to the UK and learn from you in person. Thanks so much again, Adam.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on here. I've really enjoyed it. Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you, folks, for tuning into the 182nd episode of the Athletes Podcast featuring Professor Adam Nichols. Big shout out goes to him for coming on the show, sharing his wisdom, knowledge, insights. This is obviously timely within the world of high performance sports. Competitors are looking to gain an edge. Obviously, we talked about it during the episode. There's still so much unknown when it comes to sports psychology. I appreciate you tuning into this episode. I can't wait to continue to bring you folks more content every single week here on the Athletes Podcast. Big shout out goes to Phoenix, our producer for the show. My name's David Stark, your host. Thank you folks again for tuning in to the 182nd episode. We can't wait to see you next week. Hope you have a great one. Bye.